the dirty little secret of cancel culture is it wasn't just the students getting bad. It was the administrators who were already bad meeting the new students who were much more open to settling scores with professors and students. It was this unholy alliance between these two forces meeting.
Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. All right, folks, welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through the law, philosophy, and stories that define your right to free speech. I changed up that tagline a couple of weeks ago, and now it just doesn't come out like it used to.
Yeah.
You know? It used to be an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. So our dear listeners, if it sounds weird to you, it sounds weird to me as well, and I'm still getting the hang of it. I'll have it down in no time.
You should turn it into a limerick.
How would I do that?
I don't know, make it rhyme.
We'll put producer Sam on that one.
ChatGPT could do that pretty quick for you.
You know what? I always forget that ChatGPT is a resource.
It's really good at this kind of stuff.
Yeah. I just adopted it recently, and it's scary. But I feel like it's like make or break. You got to do it at this point, because if you don't do it, someone else is going to start doing your job and doing that.
Well, now there's, I think it's a Google GPT or a Google AI tool that can take your articles and turn them into podcasts.
That was like more than a year ago. And it came out and it was eerily. Actually, they did it. It was even more than that. They did that. Suleiman, our brilliant IT guy, he ran Canceling the American Mind. Tried to do a podcast about it, and it was really good. But it does also point out how formulaic most podcasts are, except, of course, So to Speak.
Yes. Well, the one that I listened to was great. And so far as I mentioned to you guys before we started recording, I like messy podcasts where there's a lot of give and take, where questions are premised, where it's not just question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. And this one that I heard, it was exactly as I'd want the podcast to
nice.
be.
Okay.
Yeah, some interjections, the sort of dinner table conversation that might naturally happen if there aren't microphones in front of people. That's what I try and emulate on the podcast. And this did a great job at it.
Probably because it's like trained off of like the endless hours of Joe Rogan.
Yeah. I mean, does he do podcasts in that way? He lets his guests go quite some time.
He'll interject, though, I feel like.
Yeah, I guess.
I always feel funny since like promoting books, we're so reliant on podcasts. I don't really listen to podcasts.
when Joe Rogan had Ira Glasser, the former ACLU executive director, who I made a documentary about called Mighty Ira in 2020, on his podcast, Joe just would throw out like a question here, a question there, and then let Ira go for like 25 minutes.
And which he can do.
Which he can do, and that's the problem with Ira Glasser.
But really well.
He does it really well. He's one of those people who talks in perfect sentences, in perfect paragraphs, and if you will let him, perfect pages. But you need to interject in his monologue.
Oh, but nobody outdoes John McWhorter on that, though.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
he does it in like perfect iambic pentameter if you ask him to.
I'm always jealous of that skill.
Oh, it's creepy.
But you mentioned promoting books. That's why we're here today.
Yay.
We have The Canceling of the American Mind, which is your guys' book that is now out in paperback. And I guess I should introduce you guys. Of course, regular listeners will know Greg Lukianoff, president and CEO of FIRE.
Hi, everybody.
Author of Coddling the American Mind and Canceling of the American Mind. And we're also here with Rikki Schlott, who is Greg's co-author on The Canceling American Mind, a New York Post columnist. Rikki, welcome into the studio.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Is this the first time on the podcast?
Yeah, it is.
Oh my God! And I haven't got to see Rikki in a while, so this is.
Oh no,
nice.
It's not. It's my second time on the podcast. I think
we did one.
No, we did one. We did one. I think when the book came out.
Did we?
I'm pretty sure
we did.
We did.
Yep.
Yeah, we did.
You're right.
In the whirlwind of podcasts that happened when the book first came out.
How many have you guys done?
We did so many.
I don't even remember. It was really crazy, and we divided and conquered too. So I did some, and Greg did some, and we did some together. It was. I said the same terms so many times over and over and over again. It was crazy.
Yeah.
Well, let's see if we can differentiate ourselves here. Maybe I can throw some grenades into this conversation that'll
Can't stand this young woman.
I did say we can have some verbal violence on this podcast, but no physical violence, please. Let's start, I guess, for those who aren't familiar with the book. What is the origin of this book? Why a book about cancel culture?
Oh yeah, no. So I definitely, as you know, I kill myself every time I write a book. It's always way more than I can.
Yet you're still here.
Yeah. I know. Like it is one of these things that sometimes people will ask, kind of like, you got an organization, you seem to be doing stuff all the time. Like, how do you also write books? And I'm like, one, I have great co-authors, but also two, I'd kind of kill myself over these things. So after Coddling came out, I wanted to wait a while before writing another book, because I need to get back to more day-to-day work. And but I start getting the itch. I really want to write another one. So around the time the itch was getting really bad that I wanted to write my next book. I'm thinking about 2 books I want to write right now.
What was that year that you were getting this?
That would have been 2022.
Okay.
About I guess that would be about 4 years after Coddling came out. And but we found this brilliant young woman, Rikki Schlott, who I think I first met when she was 19.
I think it was like maybe 20.
Maybe 20?
Yeah, 20 or 21, because it would have been after the pandemic, yeah.
Yeah. And we kind of immediately had our eyes on her because she was like someone who was writing for reason sometimes and just writing better than people twice her age easily, and we're like, this is a real talent we've got here. So we made Rikki a fellow, and I really enjoyed working with her. And I started thinking, Coddling the American Mind was so much about the problems faced by Gen Z young women. It would be really cool, but obviously me and Haidt are not Gen Z young women.
Oh, really?
Yeah, shockingly. Haidt likes to claim he's Gen X, and he might technically be correct. Sorry, listeners. I'm a very proud Xer. But working with her, so we originally talked about writing a book that was kind of a follow-up to Coddling the American Mind. But as we were getting ready to write it, there were all these people who were actually starting to say that cancel culture, and they had been saying it, but I thought they would have shut up at some point, saying cancel culture is a hoax or a myth. And I was like, this is insane. Like we have the data to show that like from starting from 2014 up, it was a disaster for students. It was a disaster for professors. And we just have the first and foremost thing we needed to do was, 1, show the data and prove that this is happening and it's really serious. 2, I really wanted to situate it as getting people to rethink cancel culture as a way of winning arguments without actually persuading anybody, to just kind of scare them, but as part of a constellation of cheap tactics to win arguments, and then really get into how we solve it. So I think we signed the contract maybe in late 2022.
Yeah, that sounds...
Was it earlier than that?
It had to have been earlier, I think.
Yeah, you're right.
Because this came out in October 2023.
It came out right after October 7th,
Yeah,
right?
10 days after.
Yeah, okay. So it might be off by a whole year.
Yeah, I think it was probably 21 when we were talking about selling it.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
You mentioned you had the data to prove that cancel culture was happening, but I think we should probably start by defining what cancel culture is.
Sure.
What is this thing that people are debating happening or not happening?
Yeah, I gave a somewhat boring but very lawyerly kind of definition of it that we were kind of like, maybe we should make it something better than this. But at the same time, I wanted to be like hyper precise about it. And it's the uptick starting around 2014 of campaigns to get people fired, punished, ostracized, or expelled for speech that would be protected, for example, for like a public employee. Under First Amendment doctrine, but often happening in environments where the First Amendment doesn't apply, and the climate of fear that results from that situation, and it begins around 2014. So we were trying to really offer like a historical definition that essentially saying like cancel culture is something weird that started around 2014 and really kind of went crazy.
Well, you kind of have to, otherwise it's just anecdotes, right? You need to create a precise definition if you want to be able to quantify it.
Yeah.
So, Rikki, what was your experience at this time? Why did you feel like this was the right project for you? What were you seeing?
My entrance into the media scene was an op-ed for the New York Post about my experience at NYU, feeling that free speech was under siege, and having hidden books under my bed in my dorm room because I was afraid that my roommates might see them and cancel me. And I very much Thomas Sowell books, Jordan Peterson books. We did Jordan Peterson's podcast, and now I'm very canceled by those same roommates, or not my roommates to give them credit, but other peers at NYU. But I very much self-censored on campus and had the experience not yet of being canceled until I did put myself out there, but was like living that day to day until the pandemic. And it was kind of like my life story. And so I think having had that recent experience on a college campus, which is kind of like the heart of cancel culture, or was the kind of ground zero for it, made me feel like I was a collaborator that maybe could put some meat on the bones of the story too.
Yeah, so you were experiencing this at college in ways that maybe don't always capture headlines. It's just the environment. It's the zeitgeist. Meanwhile, Greg,
absolutely.
You're here at Fire. What are you seeing that is signaling to you we have a problem here?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing this for 24 years now almost. And Fire is 25 years old last year. And, I started in 2001, and I always explain that even in 2001, it was already easier to get in trouble for what you said on a college campus than I expected. And my whole background was specializing in First Amendment free speech law. But overwhelmingly, it was administrators doing the censoring. Students tended to be very good on free speech. They came to each other's aid. They protested sometimes. They fought on behalf of the professors' free speech rights in some cases. And it was really more a problem of the administrators. But something really dramatic changed very clearly around 2013, 2014. And students started showing up in large numbers, demanding new speech codes, demanding professors get in trouble. That really accelerated in 2017. But that started to really spike in 2014. So it was a very sharp, sudden change. And a lot of the first exploration of this was actually in my book that I wrote with Jonathan Haidt, Coddling the American Mind, trying to explain how we believe. Oh, it's going to be, by the way, the original article is 10 years old this August.
Oh, wow.
Don't tell me that. Gosh, that feels like yesterday.
17.
I know, but it feels like yesterday.
Neither of you are old. I'm old. 2013, 2014, the idea of coddling was essentially the observation that the same habits that are peculiar to students showing up on campus around 2014 would be really bad for free speech and academic freedom because they were sort of justifying new reasons to restrict freedom of speech and academic freedom, but also that were relied on a way of thinking that would actually make those students anxious and depressed. And unfortunately, the data has really supported, that idea that we were onto something because both things happened. But canceling the American Mind was much more to focus on the toll in terms of professors and students that we saw after 2014, and it really got bad. And I think one of the things that listeners might not understand is that historically, it is not normal for students to sign petitions against their professors to get them fired just for their research, teaching, and
what they say on social media.
What they say on social media. Yeah. It's not saying this is completely unprecedented, but in terms of scale, it is very unusual for students to be the ones leading the charge to get professors fired.
What are they usually doing? Just debating them?
Protesting in some cases, being snotty to them in other cases.
Is what qualifies as a cancel campaign what that protest is demanding?
Yes. That's a huge part of it. If you're just saying this person is wrong and a jerk, more power to you. We're right there with you. And I want to be clear about this. This is a disagreement between me and Randy Kennedy
at Harvard.
At Harvard, yeah. He talked about, for example, our deplatforming database being an assault on freedom of speech, essentially, because of course students have the right to demand that someone not speak on their campus. And I was like, of course they do. We defend people's right to say that, to demand that someone not speak. But so if we didn't believe in their right to do it, we'd be demanding they be punished for doing that. We're not saying that people should be punished for engaging in cancel culture. What we are saying, however, is that you can have movements that censor and make people shut up and chill speech that are directed from individuals that are fundamentally illiberal impulses. And that's one of the reasons why we're not arguing for cancel culture being banned. We're arguing for free speech culture where you're much more tolerant of people you disagree with. And yeah, do I think you have the right to get a campaign together to ruin someone's life for a bad tweet? Absolutely, you have that right. Do I think that's admirable or good for a democratic society where candor is really important? No. And I always have to remind people, on liberty, like the most brilliant book ever written on freedom of speech.
By John Stuart Mill, 1859.
Yeah, that's same year as Origin of Species. The same year, and also a book called Self-Help. Anyway, sorry. Literally called that first in the genre. Anyway, he is very clear. He's not arguing that the state of the law was really bad in England at the time. He says very clearly that actually, due to some cases in 1858, it was actually pretty good. He was worried about a conformist culture that was actually very harmful to the exchange of ideas.
And that's actually what Alexis de Tocqueville was worried about too in colonial America when he was it wasn't colonial America, I think it was America at that point when he was touring the country and reporting back to France.
Yeah.
So Rikki, though, this isn't just a story of college campuses, right? I'm looking here at part 3 of your book. You study cancel culture in comedy, in elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, in corporate America, in the media. What was happening there?
I mean, I think that it really has trickled down from educational schools.
So that's where
down
it started.
to. I mean, I believe in many ways that is where it started, but it's trickled down all the way to. I was horrified to hear in middle schools from a lot of parents that would tell me that their kids had gotten canceled for how their parents had voted by their peers, and they're like in 5th grade and they don't even have political viewpoints yet.
Man, I hope I will not be held accountable for my parents' beliefs. My parents are great; they don't have crazy beliefs, but you never know.
No, truly. That happened on my high school campus too. Like people during the 2016 election were looking at people's parents' voter registrations and stuff, and like it was like a big thing of like, oh, our parents are Republicans, which is really crazy.
I didn't know the registration part of that story. That's awful.
Yeah. That was a big deal on my campus. Like people that happened very commonly.
In the name of tolerance, though.
Yeah, of course. Of course. And also, not to mention, a lot of people who were Republicans didn't even vote for Trump. It wasn't but that aside, I would say of all the case studies that we did, the one on science and medicine was the most concerning to me because that's really like an area where you don't want conformity, and the scientific method depends on a lack of ideological rigidity and people being willing to say, I don't really agree with your hypothesis. And I think in like the COVID-19 pandemic was a perfect moment where we would have had, I think, much better outcomes for just like institutional trust in our social fabric if it was okay to question some things that were not yet set in stone and totally known as the pandemic was unfolding and as science was discovering more and more about the pandemic. And so I think of all the case studies, that one was the most frightening.
Well, can we talk about some specific stories? Greg, maybe I'll start with you. Is there like one story of a cancellation in this book that really stands out to you as being emblematic of the problem? And then Rikki, I'd love to hear if there's one that stands out to you as well.
I mean, the short answer is no, because I've been like overwhelmed by stories that essentially you really can't distill it into a single story. But the one that's the most emotionally, most heartbreaking one in it, and I talk about it in some detail, is my admittedly very conservative friend Mike Adams. Who he started at University of North Carolina, Wilmington, as a progressive, but then he became an evangelical Christian and became the rarest kind of conservative on most campuses, not a libertarian conservative, but a full-on social conservative. And he started really pushing back against, things on the left. And he always credited me because someone like this, of course, is going to get in trouble a lot. So Fire defended him from like the very early days when he got in trouble. But he credited me for recommending the book How to Talk Dirty and Influence People by Lenny Bruce.
We are in the Lenny Bruce podcast studio.
Yes, we are now, by the way. That I was reading it at the time, which, contrary to Nick Gillespie, is actually a very funny book. And I recommended it to him, and Mike read it. And I remember he was on like talk radio when he was crediting me as being the person who was like, yeah, Greg told me to recommend this book. And I realized I got to be much more in your face conservative, much sharper, I was like, dude, I created a monster. And in 2020, he posted something where he was complaining about lockdowns in his state. And he posted a tweet of him and a bunch of dudes in a state that didn't have lockdowns drinking beers and said, and he posted, Massa governor of North Carolina, I don't remember who the name of it was, let my people go. Insensitive, for the use of the word Massa. Let my people go, however, of course, is like, that's right out of, the Bible, and for that matter, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And there was, just like for the rest of June and July of 2020, which was unlike anything Fired had ever seen, there was campaigns of score settling with basically every professor who'd ever said something offensive. And so since I knew Mike, I thought Mike was this extremely confident dude, and that he knew what he was doing, I didn't actually, to my eternal regret, I didn't actually write Mike until when I heard that he was being targeted to be fired, because I'm like, Mike can handle himself. Like, we got to help all these other professors. And so I wrote him kind of late, and he'd already taken the severance package because students started protesting it. They demanded he be fired because Mike had actually defeated UNCW in a previous court decision. They knew they'd lose in court against him, so they gave him an okay severance package, not a particularly generous one. And he stepped down. So I only talked to him after he'd signed the papers. And I had to break the news to him, like, there's not really anything we can do for you. You signed the severance. And I said, but he sounded bad. Like, the students were still coming to his house. They were saying, like, people were talking about, like, his wife and child, like engaged in, like, sex acts. Like, it was really, and he was clearly scared because he called the police about it. And a week after I called him, he killed himself. And so, that really stuck with me, and particularly the idea that when I started talking about my friend Mike killing himself, I got a number of people basically saying, well, he was pretty terrible, and I'm like, dude, he was a person. So yeah, that chapter was the hardest to write.
In a culture of free speech, what would be the appropriate free speech friendly response to Mike's tweet? Yeah. If people found it offensive, how should people have responded?
Well, like I said, it is arguably even appropriate. You can demand that someone be fired. It's particularly incumbent on administrators to not humor this, and that administrators must be the ones saying no, and fast and quickly and actually decisivly. And
that outcome is not viable, that we are not following it. We're a public university bound by the First Amendment. So
not even not viable, but not this is not the environment for that. We don't do that. But the dirty little secret of cancel culture is it wasn't just the students getting bad. It was the administrators, the administrators who were already bad meeting the new students who were much more open to settling scores with professors and students. It was this unholy alliance between these two forces meeting. So, but there's a million ways you can protest this. You can just flat out protest it. You can write an op-ed. You can respond in scathing language. But when you start calling that someone be fired for something that is clearly protected, one, that creates real First Amendment issues. But it also, for free speech culture, you really want to understand where people are coming from. You want to understand like what they were getting at. And I think if
and presumably you want to change his mind, right? Yeah. This is the story of Daryl Davis, the black man who would meet with members of the Ku Klux Klan and have conversations with them with the idea being, hey, I'm a black man. All your preconceived notions about who I am and what I represent are wrong.
Yeah.
And I visited his home. I saw all the Klan's robes, dozens and dozens of Klan robes from former Klansmen who gave up their robes after meeting him. None of that would have probably happened if he had just sought to get them fired, for example, as opposed to sitting down over coffee and having a conversation.
Yeah, but also like if the administration had just slowed the whole process down, this would have faded. Always, like, that's the thing about cancel culture campaigns is that they're very hot and they don't have a lot, and they have a lot of heat, but they don't burn for very long. And a lot of these
you got to ride them out.
Situations would be avoided. But here's the problem. A lot of administrators didn't want to write it out. They wanted the momentum to get rid of a conservative gadfly like Mike.
Yeah. Rikki, is there anything that stands out to you?
This young woman, probably mid-20s, who was appointed editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue, and she had tweets that were like at the time already a decade old from when she was like 14 or 15 that were definitely offensive and off-color that people resurfaced when she was hired, but she ended up getting fired, or I don't even know if she had been hired, but they called off her hiring. And it turns out that in the process of she'd already apologized for them, A. And in the process of her getting hired, she already had said, like, these are full disclosure, these are out there. Like, I've distanced myself. So the company knew that they existed. So the only reason that she got fired was this public pressure campaign, which I think is insane to accept somebody on that basis and then fire them when like push comes to shove and you get shamed for it. A ton of big advertisers pulled out over that too, which I think is really shameful. And the thing about that case that really I think is most important is as young people today who grew up online, come of age and enter the workforce, like I had an iPhone when I was 10. Like everybody who's now a new hire had access to technology way too early and has done something stupid at some point. That probably isn't like great and ideal and they'd prefer not to be out there. If we have a culture that has that as like the status quo of like we just fire people and major companies pull their advertising and stuff, I think that's an absolute disaster for society.
So her name is Alexi McCammond.
Yes.
Okay,
that's right.
And I want to read a passage from your book here and then ask you guys about it because I think it speaks to what you were just saying, Greg. In the following days, McCammond apologized to her future coworkers in private meetings and engaged in one-on-one talks with some of the offended Teen Vogue staffers. She also tweeted a public apology, reiterating, "I've apologized for my past racist and homophobic tweets and will reiterate that there's no excuse for perpetuating those awful stereotypes in any way."
Also, she's not white, too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
She's black, right?
Yeah, I think she's biracial.
She added that she was so sorry to have used such hurtful and inexcusable language. Nevertheless, pressure to can McCammond continued to mount, not just from Teen Vogue staffers, but from their advertisers too. Burt's Bees, Ultra Beauty both halted advertising campaigns in response to the tweets. When the public shaming became too much to bear, McCammond resigned. So the apologies don't really work.
No, the apologies they're basically confessing.
I mean, it seems like she did everything right. She had one-on-one meetings. She publicly apologized. She privately apologized, but the staffers were still coming after her.
It's confessing you're a witch. And I like apologies. Like basically, I always
should work if they're heartfelt and genuine.
I always had a policy. Like when people ask me, like, should I apologize earlier on my career? I'm like, that's not for me to decide. Follow your conscience. If you think you did something wrong, but I do sometimes remind them, don't apologize if you don't think you did anything wrong.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, if you do apologize in these kind of like moral kind of spirals, it's confessing essentially that you're a witch, and it only makes it worse.
And that's why Donald Trump never apologizes and seemingly is Teflon done and never gets in trouble.
Yeah, unfortunately, that seems to be good advice.
Although I have to like ask you on that front too, like in that sort of instance where like she did use slurs and stuff, like it'd be hard for me to say like she shouldn't say like, I'm sorry that I used those words. Those are not reflective of me. Like, however, I've previously apologized for that. Like, I should she not have said like what should she say? I mean, I don't think you should do an apology tour with every single individual. I think that's a little over the top. Yeah. But like, should she not have said sorry? Like, I've never quite figured out what the actual like alternative is to that.
Yeah. No. And just so the listeners know, if the example that I'm remembering is that she used the term Asian eyes for waking up with puffy eyes.
I think there was also some homophobic slurs in there. I can't remember.
What was there? If I can find them here.
Yeah.
That what she claimed was kind of like slang at the time, like in the black community, which is of course offensive, but at the same time, like But
she used slurs for gay people, homo, and derogatory use of gay. I think that's what I see here. That and then the Asian eyes note that you had before.
I mean, like I would be inclined to apologize too, and that's one of the reasons why it kind of breaks my heart to say that maybe you shouldn't. Yeah, but or if you apologize, it's got to be something strong. It's like, listen, I regret doing that. However, I've said this over and over again, and I do feel like I'm being treated like you have to. You're put in a position essentially where you have to push back.
Yeah.
Part of me just wants to say, can I appeal to common sense and say,
no.
I was 15 years old. Yeah. I was an idiot. I think most people who are 15 years old are idiots.
Oh my God, I was such an idiot.
And I actually do think that resonates with most people. And I think that's why you've seen the backlash to cancel culture, because people had this sort of moral awakening that like, hey, we don't want to cancel people for things that they said when they were a teenager, right? We have in this country, presumably, this belief in redemption and forgiveness. And if you can't be redeemed or forgiven for what you did at 15, what can you be redeemed or forgiven for? We even in the criminal context treat 15-year-olds different than we treat 25-year-olds. for example.
Although I do think, though, we really have like a crazy punitive disciplinary system in like high schools and middle schools even that can change your trajectory in life if you get in trouble in high school. Like you could end up at a different college, you could end up with a different job down the road. Like there is some real permanence to that age demographic that I mean, I saw that maybe it's a private school situation, but I certainly saw that having gone to boarding schools, like people that made one mistake, life-changing sometimes.
Yeah, I wonder if there are differences even between when you were in school and when I was in school in the mid-2000s. But how much did Twitter, now X, have to do with these cancel campaigns?
I think quite a lot. I'll let you take that.
Yeah, actually, this is a nice chance for me to plug a different book. I'm reading Musa Al-Gharbi's "We Have Never Been Woke," and I'm already writing the review of the book in my head. And the very first line is going to be, first of all, I'd like to apologize to Musa Al-Gharbi for not reading this sooner, because it's excellent, and it talks about like how self-serving a lot of the interests of elites can actually be. In that, basically, describing cancel culture as like a way of sort of showing yourself sort of socially superior at the cost of other people. Sorry,
the role of Twitter.
Oh yeah,
in this. And I have to say, Musa's book is sitting on my bookshelf. I'm writing my own book right now, so I'm really trying not to read anything that's not for my book. But he sent it to me because he wanted to come on the podcast. So maybe you and I can have a conversation with him about
excellent.
it. Yeah. And his agent is my agent.
Yeah, and I realized one of the only things that like I'd really disagree with Musa about is like on 2 pages, and the rest I'm like completely like I think it's brilliant and very important. But he does talk about, and one of the things I do disagree with is he talks about cancel culture. Well, cancel culture has happened all the time. There was trashing in the 1960s, like the 1930s in Marxist circles. They were incredibly doctrinaire, and they'd ruin your life and get you kicked out if you weren't doctrinaire. But I try to point out.
Coincidentally, Ayn Rand would do that to people in her inner circle.
Well, that's shocking. But I feel like what you're saying is ostracization. Like eliminating people who aren't doctrinaire is a theme that repeats. Of course, it is. But one of the arguments that Rikki and I were making was essentially the uptick in is we're talking about scale and nature in terms of canceling, because you can't find something that really happened on this kind of crazy scale. And the thing that, and one of the defining characteristics of it that did require technology is you had to be able to almost instantaneously create the perception of or the reality of an angry mob trying to get someone fired. Mm-hmm. And that literally was not possible until technologies like Twitter, like other social media, where you really could create the sense that there are tens of thousands of people who are demanding you fire Jerry or some other person in your organization, in a way that when you wanted to get someone fired from like their job before, a lot of cases, you'd send like an angry letter, to the company, and that would be the end of it. Mm-hmm. So it was a new phenomenon in that sense, and because of the technology.
And was it primarily a left-wing phenomenon? Because when you think about cancel culture, you often think about left-wing excess, so to speak. And then, in the current context, you often think of Trump as a backlash against that, or at least that's how it's often positioned. Do you see it as a left-wing phenomenon?
I mean, I think originally in terms of Twitter cancel culture, predominantly it was. But it's interesting now to see, like now that Twitter is X, it feels like a lot of the pushback that I'm getting when I personally think that I'm being consistent with my viewpoints is from the right. And it's like, I thought you were more conservative. Like there's a lot of conservative culture, cancel culture going on X, and Blue Sky has become like the place for all the left-wing cancel culture people have moved. So it's interesting to see none of those voices really interacting, and everyone's getting even more insular in their 2 little camps. Yeah. Although Blue Sky is like a fraction of the user base. But
Blue Sky doesn't believe cancel culture even happens because they're in like their little bubble where they can actually believe something like that.
Well, in the same way that old school Twitter didn't really believe it
absolutely. That's one of the reasons why we had to write the book, because I felt like it was so irresponsible to make that argument.
It's interesting too, though, but like they'll throw stones at people and like centrist people and stuff, but like they don't hear them because they're just in Blue Sky. Like a lot of people just have no idea what's going on and what sort of critiques they're getting, which is interesting. They've definitely like insulated themselves and their critiques from a lot of the people that they're critiquing.
Yeah. Yes. So basically, long story short, like the cancel culture being like the campaigns to get people fired definitely started on the left. We talk about a lot of examples of cancel culture on the right, though, in the book. And if we were writing it today, we'd have a lot more examples.
For sure.
But partially because our definition is about something that's about getting regular people into campaigns to get people fired. What's actually happening with the Trump administration has a little bit less of the campaign to get people fired and just plain old ordinary, I'm exerting federal power, and sometimes in very arbitrary and sometimes completely illegal ways to get people punished, which the only reason why I wouldn't call it necessarily cancel culture is because it's something that's even graver and more direct, which is just the exertion of executive power, raw political power, and just it's old-fashioned censorship in a lot of cases.
So this is like Chris Krebs, for example, having his global entry revoked because the Trump administration doesn't like him, or going after these law firms because they represent or hire people that the Trump administration doesn't like. These are just
the law firm stuff scares me in particular, but it's all scary.
It's almost like institutional cancel culture versus individual. Like I feel like he's like painting with a much broader brush than like specifically going after one person, if that makes sense. It's like, let's just take it down Harvard as a whole.
Yeah. And even during the Obama and Biden administrations when cancel culture was at its peak, I can't remember a president going after their political enemies in the same way. I mean, you have Biden at the podium talking about how Elon Musk should be looked into, and that's a problem. But it's it seems much more overt now.
Oh, absolutely, and of course, like we're going to get one thing. Actually, I think is fun, Rikki, is fun. For nerds, is that we talk about in the book. We talk about this idea of there being tactics that both the right and the left use to win arguments without winning arguments beyond cancel culture. And then we talk about the left having what we call the perfect rhetorical fortress, which is just layer after layer of ways to dismiss people, basically largely on identity. But then on the right, we talk about the efficient rhetorical fortress, which is just this idea that, if you claim that someone is woke or a liberal or a libtard, you can dismiss them that way. But also, by the final one, like if they're not pro-MAGA, you can dismiss them as well. But the one that actually really predominates now on the sort of like MAGA right to justify everything is, what I've called industrial grade whataboutism. It's always pointing to, where were you on this other thing that happened under the Obama administration? Now, the fun thing about being at FIRE is it's almost always, we were only involved in campus until 2022. But if it's anything to do with campus, it's like, yeah, we're all over it. Like we're perfectly consistent on this stuff. But watching kind of like the backlash just always being whataboutism. But yeah, the scale of the targeting of enemies, is scary, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's in some ways its rawest form dealing with law firms, because in many cases these are just law firms that had lawyers there who were involved in the Mueller investigation, for example. Or
they represent Dominion voting system,
like real just bad old fashioned, I guess you'd call it, kind of payback and retribution for slights. And the craziest argument that they're making is one, they're threatening to withdraw security clearance from these lawyers in many cases, or I guess in this case, global entry, which is nuts.
That's a separate matter. The Chris Krebs stings. But with the law firms, it's security clearance, it's access to federal buildings, it's government contracts.
Access to federal buildings is the one that I think is the most like, are you freaking kidding me? You're telling lawyers they can't enter courtrooms? I honestly think that's the least well appreciated scary thing that the Trump administration is doing.
Or even represent clients in mediation that happens in federal buildings, because often that mediation will happen with federal agencies.
Yeah.
So the chill is, it seems, the point. And during the height of cancel culture, I'm sure you guys know Randall Sullivan, who was the head of a house at Harvard, represented Harvey Weinstein. He's also Randy Sullivan was also a
Ronald Sullivan.
Ronald Sullivan, sorry, excuse me. Ronald Sullivan is also a law professor at Harvard, and does what good practitioners do, which is represent clients, give them robust defenses, and before the government can take away people's liberty. And he was canceled for doing this. He lost his job as the House dean or master. I forget what they call him at Harvard. I always confuse Harvard and Yale with these House
something
master.
Offensive.
Yes, something offensive that subsequently changed.
Grand
I'm sure.
Moff.
Yeah, but that was a cancel campaign, and it was a cancel campaign that was motivated by who this lawyer represented. And now you have a cancel campaign from the other side that's motivated by who these law firms represent, or even who they hire as lawyers within their firm. So what's good for the goose, I guess, is good for the gander. And I've talked about how in the Harvard context, now that the Trump administration is going after Harvard for Title VI violations and just ignoring the law in doing so, we had a lot of allies when the Obama administration was doing that in the Title IX context.
Yeah.
And the industrial grade whataboutism wasn't there. Yeah. Now the whataboutism is coming from us, and it's saying like, wait, you guys were on our side during the abuses under Title IX. Why are you ignoring them now under Title VI?
Yeah. Well, they have the argument at least that they think the Title VI abuses are real and at a scale, of anti-Semitism at scale at Harvard or these other schools. And I'm sympathetic to that. Like I think certainly like Columbia and Harvard had a real problem. I've been saying for almost 10 years that there is a real anti-Semitism problem in elite higher ed and in schools in California and probably in other places. That being said, you have to follow process. Just because there's a bad actor, it doesn't mean you can magically make up new powers. And the Trump administration, there's all sorts of process that they have to follow, including giving the university chance to fix things that the Trump administration is just utterly ignoring with regard to Harvard. So I think some supporters of ours get a little bit of whiplash that FIRE has been very critical of Harvard. They deservedly finished twice dead last in our campus free speech ranking. But again, that doesn't mean that suddenly the Trump administration, the executive, gets to basically say, well, now we can pull all your federal funding and even potentially your nonprofit status, basically assuming that all of this stuff is true and ignore entirely all the protections you're supposed to have.
And not to mention so many of the demands, too, have nothing to do with the Title VI violations. They're just completely beside the point.
Yeah. Well, and that's a weird thing about this attack on Harvard, which, yes, Greg, you're right. They've been a bad actor on the free speech, academic freedom front for years. But the justifications the government's using to go after them are a mix of Title VI violations, racial discrimination violations, but just pure ideological disagreement. Like if you look at President Trump's Truth Social feed, he's going after them for hiring certain Democratic politicians after they're done in office, or talking about their ideology or their sickness or their left-wing bias.
How much time do you spend on Truth Social?
I spend far too much time on X and looking at the Trump's Truth Social.
It can't be good for your blood pressure.
No. I have this Oura ring which talks about how
I was admiring that.
Yeah, and I'm always at the stressed level. I don't feel stressed, but I guess if that's my baseline, then I wouldn't feel it.
Okay.
But there's relaxed, restored. I'm just never in those areas.
FIRE is not a relaxing job, shall we say?
I have fun. I don't know. I don't want to fall asleep at the job. So I like being engaged.
They do say in psychology, reconceptualize anxiety as excitement, and I'm not always that good at that, but clearly you are.
I don't know. I also started losing my beard here, and my doctor was like, "That's usually caused by stress. It's like alopecia areata." And I said, "I don't feel stressed."
I've been putting a little bit of polonium in your coffee because I am Russian.
Oh, so that's it.
Yeah,
I guess I got to stop drinking coffee. That's what we do. But in my defense on the Title IX and Title VI point, and for those who don't know, Title IX governs sexual misconduct and federally funded education activities and programs, and Title VI deals with race, color, and national origin. Has been interpreted to also prevent anti-Semitism on campus. The Obama administration saw a rape problem on campus, and they said there was a real rape problem on campus. And they tried to solve that rape problem in part by removing due process protections and implementing speech codes.
Yeah.
And now what the Trump administration is doing, except in the Title VI context, is removing due process protections and implementing speech codes. Yeah. And that's a problem in both cases. It's just some of the arguments that I'm hearing from conservatives now about the Trump administration, it's just like those arguments weren't ever made in the context of Title IX. It's like it's the government's money. The government can take it away whenever it wants. I was like, that was the same issue that we were fighting in the Title IX context too. You never made those arguments. So I guess that's me doing whataboutism.
Well, actually, this is interesting. One thing that is interesting is that Rikki and I come from kind of different political directions. But I always have thought, getting to know Rikki better, that if you'd been around in the 90s, you definitely would have been considered left of center for your overall views.
I think so.
But definitely you felt like a conservative by comparison, for a lot of your life. Where do you feel at home anywhere now?
No, I mean, I consider myself a libertarian.
Yeah.
More or less. But I think I was definitely in the first Trump administration more in the camp of like a lot of the things that he says, like people freak out about it and he doesn't really do a lot of them and like chill out. But this time I'm like, okay, he's doing them and this is really bad.
Yeah.
So I definitely have more TDS this time around. But I would say like I consider myself a libertarian, but like because I came of age in the like very woke like iteration of what the Democratic Party looked like, I definitely considered myself more conservative when I was younger.
Yeah.
Just in kind of the same way that like I feel like you hear now about like so many young men saying like they're very conservative. I think that they're kind of having the same reaction that I at one point had, which is like all of my teachers are telling me that like I have to introduce myself with pronouns even if I don't feel like that's necessary. And like those sorts of like formative things where I'm just like, I kind of wanted to rage against that as a kid. But now I would say I'm a libertarian and probably like centrist politically.
We were talking before we started rolling here, Rikki, about how the book came out, 10 days after October 7th? How did October 7th change all of this?
Very selfishly, it was terrible for sales. It swamped everything else. It was not a great time to have a book come out. But the funny thing was, so I got, as Rikki can attest, she was so much more kind of like emotionally stable than I was during this whole thing. The process of writing this depressed the living hell out of me, and it made me very sad and very anxious because since we were talking so much about the ways that you can dismiss somebody without taking their argument seriously, I was like, okay, we just wrote about how people are going to treat this book. They're just going to be like, they're not going to actually read it, and they're just going to make up things in the perfect rhetorical fortress to be like, oh, this is a right-wing book, or like whatever. Like they're just going to dismiss it, to not read it. But the interesting thing about October 7th is that it definitely led to a lot of behavior on campus that very quickly got people to realize, oh wow, there's something really seriously wrong here. Like the ideology was so intense, particularly on the left, that it kind of freaked a lot of even centrists out. So I think that even if the book had come out just a little bit later, people would have kind of gotten that everything we were talking about in the book was relevant to how October 7th would actually pan out. And how the backlash would go, and all of this, and all this stuff. But that's also one of the reasons why in the new paperback edition has updated data. It has we made a number of additions to the text itself, but it also has a 2025 campus free speech rankings at the back of it, which is nice to update, in which Harvard finishes last. But it also has an epilogue talking about how crazy things got on campus. Because Rikki, are you still a Columbia student?
I'm enrolled.
Yeah,
I don't really know.
So you're not taking classes? No. I'm assuming that's what that means.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were at NYU.
I was at NYU. I dropped out, and then I enrolled at Columbia. I took a class during the encampment semester, which is interesting. I got the pandemic at NYU and the encampment at Columbia, so really striking out with my college experience.
If you try and transfer, I think the colleges are going to look skeptically at you. It's like, what sort of problems are you going to bring upon us?
But it was interesting to be at Columbia with a press pass and a student ID because I had access like no one else did because they tried to keep press to just 2 hours a day at all times. So I was able to write about it in a different way. But certainly like the experience of being somebody that was like called to talk about cancel culture on TV and also called on to talk about campus culture after October 7th, there were some very clear early on cancellations that were free speech violations that did put me in a really kind of strange position, sometimes on live TV, trying to thread that needle too. And certainly in like areas and on shows where that wasn't really an expected take too. So it definitely was like a test of like, are you really a free speech champion?
Well, that's the problem. That's the problem with cancel culture, right? And Greg, you talk about this all the time, is when you're talking about culture, it's always going to be a little bit amorphous. Now, in the book, of course, you try and define what cancel culture is in order to quantify it and speak about the period that I think even if you don't buy your definition or your data, I think most people in their gut feel like something significant happened. Yeah. There was this culture of conformity. There was this culture of pile-on. There was this mob mentality that went after people, in many cases, for holding widely accepted opinions
or
that just weren't often spoken about.
Or cracking a joke that in some cases you actually thought was actually woke but was intentionally misinterpreted because someone wanted to be outraged at you.
Yeah, but it's also hard because there are some real transgressive, offensive, bigoted things that people get canceled for.
Yeah.
For example, I know for us, after Trump's assassination attempt, there were people who went on social media talking about how they wish the shooter hadn't missed, including one woman who worked, I think, at Home Depot, for example, as a cashier, and had a pile-on on social media and got fired from her job at Home Depot.
Sorry, guys, that's cancel culture. We're pretty clear about that.
But it's nevertheless,
unsympathetic.
Unsympathetic.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
so you're trying to define something in some cases that is not always easily definable, or there's not always an easy solution or response for it.
I did have so in the appendix we get in we go a little bit more in the nitty gritty and some of the law by comparison. I do think, sometimes like people listen, a lot of people will argue something isn't cancel culture. And I try to reframe it to be kind of like, what you're saying is you think canceling this person in this question was justified. And that if that's your opinion, defend it, but don't pretend if it's a campaign to get someone fired for their speech, you're talking about something completely different.
Yeah. So I think we can all agree that the McCarthy era is over now. Is the cancel culture era over, even if it's like the Roman Empire and you don't quite know when it ends or when it started?
1453.
Do you think cancel culture is dead?
No, but I do. I think it's. I think it still lives in corners. I think it is less severe, and the more pressing issue right now is actually good old fashioned exercise of state power against speech.
What about you, Rikki? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think it just is taking a different form and has new targets now. And I mean, I still feel in some sense that even if it is federally directed, it still is kind of cancel culture and in a sense to target students over op-eds and stuff. I mean, functionally, I think it's very similar, if not definitionally exactly what we were talking about. I think it is quite similar.
Yeah.
But would you say worse because it's coming from the government as opposed to a Twitter mob? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear to me that it's in some ways a reactionary kind of causal thing too, in some ways. It's learning from example about how you take someone down for their ideas. I don't think that it came out of a vacuum that the administration thinks that you can attack people like that, because we've been doing that in different ways. It just hasn't been federally directed.
Yeah. The one of the reasons why I think this book will continue to be very useful for a long time coming is it definitely explains how we got here, because I'm definitely running into a little bit on social media every so often someone pops up and kind of points at one of us being kind of well, your advocacy led to this backlash. And I'm like, our advocacy did not lead to this backlash. Behavior largely on the left actually led to a backlash. And if you're saying we shouldn't have covered it, I think that's nuts, and I think that's self-indulgent.
Yeah.
It's also an argument for never doing anything ever to correct any excess.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, I guess we're just supposed to sit here and not do anything because your advocacy against this excess could lead to a backlash that's the same or worse.
Yeah, and I can't imagine if it had been some other Republican president in power that a lot of the, maybe we would have a situation where some of the reforms were being in higher ed, for example, were being pursued in completely kosher ways. So I think I think that there's a desire to pretend like the thing that actually led to the backlash didn't really happen or wasn't that big of a deal in the first place, and it's kind of like two things can be true at the same time.
Yeah, is
that the problem was really bad and it really alienated most Americans in a big way, and the response to it is scary.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to leave it there, folks. The book is The Canceling of the American Mind, now out in paperback with a new epilogue?
That new epilogue,
new data,
new data, and the 2025 campus free speech rankings in the back.
And it has very big text.
I'm such a believer in that as someone who doesn't like to have to wear my glasses.
And now that I have to start wearing glasses, I am very appreciative of this.
Haidt and I are very big on little details that make reading easier. It's one of the reasons why we kind of hated the British version of Coddling the American Mind because it made the text too small, and they thought we were being a little silly about this. And I'm like, no, you want something to you want to remove as many barriers to people reading your books, and if you make the text too small, it's difficult.
They also spell their words wrong.
My mother is British. Thank you very much. Everything deserves a U.
All right, Rikki Schlott, Greg Lukianoff, thanks for being here. I am Nico Perino, and this podcast is recorded and edited by a rotating roster of my Fire colleagues, including Sam Lee, Aaron Reese, and Chris Maltby. The podcast is produced by Sam Lee, and you can learn more about So to Speak by subscribing to our YouTube channel or Substack page, both of which feature video versions of this conversation. You can follow us on X by searching for the handle Free Speech Talk, and you can send us feedback at sotospeak@thefire.org. Again, that is sotospeak@thefire.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Reviews help us attract new listeners to the show.
And please support Fire.
And please support Fire. And buy Greg and Rikki's future books, too. And this book as well. So, folks, until next time, I thank you all again for listening.